If you were to pick one NBA team name that embodied the concept of losing, you would pick the Charlotte Bobcats. The Charlotte Bobcats were an expansion team added to the league in 2004. A common misconception is that the Charlotte Bobcats were renamed from the previous Charlotte Hornets. That's actually not the case. The previous Charlotte Hornets of the 90s with Alonzo Mourning and whatnot actually relocated to New Orleans, where they were the New Orleans Hornets. The New Orleans Hornets changed their name to the New Orleans Pelicans in 2013, and the following year the Charlotte Bobcats changed their name to the Charlotte Hornets. So yeah, it's a bit confusing, but the current Charlotte Hornets team isn't actually the same Charlotte Hornets team of the 90s. But anyways, the Bobcats are the most recent expansion team in the NBA, and like most expansion teams, their early years featured a lot of losing. Unfortunately, they never quite got out of the losing trend, and even till this day, they've had very minimal success. In the 10 years between 2004 and 2014, the Charlotte Bobcats only made the playoffs twice. Once was in 2014, led by Al Jefferson and a young Kemba Walker, and the other was in 2010, led by Steven Jackson and Gerald Wallace. This video is about the latter player. Gerald Wallace spent 7 seasons and the majority of his prime in Charlotte. Many consider him to be the greatest player in franchise history, although Kemba Walker is slowly but surely overtaking that title. Let's dive into his career and what made him special as a player. What's up guys, my name is Mark. First, let's go into a recap of his career. Gerald Wallace was drafted in 2001 by the Sacramento Kings with the 25th overall pick. For the first 3 years of his career, Wallace was stuck on the Sacramento bench, which makes sense given that the Kings from 2002 to 2004 were consistent playoff contenders, and they had a lot of good players ahead of Wallace. In 2004, Wallace went to the Charlotte Bobcats as part of the expansion draft. On a team with very few competent basketball players, Gerald Wallace was given full permission to explore his potential as a player. By his third year, Wallace had blossomed into a two-way star, averaging 18 points, 7 boards on 56.8% true shooting. And although the Bobcats remained a lottery team year after year, they did slowly make improvements. Their win totals went as such: 18, 26, 33, 32, 35. During these years, Wallace kept developing various aspects of his game. One of the more obvious improvements was his free throw shooting. Early in his career, Wallace was about a 50% free throw shooter, but gradually he worked his way up to an 80% free throw shooter. In 2009, the Bobcats traded away Raja Bell for Steven Jackson. Steven Jackson would prove to be a perfect fit alongside Gerald Wallace in the 2009-2010 season. Jackson would actually lead the team in scoring at 21 points per game. However, the best player on the team was undoubtedly still Gerald Wallace. Offensively, Wallace put up 18 and 10 with 48% shooting from the field, 37% from 3, and 80% from the free throw line. With the arrival of Jackson, Gerald Wallace could spend more energy on defense too. The Charlotte Hornets actually ended up as the #1 overall defense that season, which carried their otherwise mediocre offense. Wallace was indisputably the anchor of that defense. That season, Wallace was third in the NBA in defensive rating, just behind Dwight Howard and Andrew Bogut. Despite being a wing player, Wallace led the team in rebounds by a significant margin. He also averaged 1.5 steals and 1.1 blocks per game, which are impressive, but what's interesting here is that these two numbers were far from his career high. In fact, back in 2006, Wallace had actually averaged 2.5 steals and 2.1 blocks per game in the same season, and if I'm not mistaken, the only two other players in history who have ever put up those numbers are Hakeem Olajuwon and David Robinson. On most nights, Wallace would be guarding the best opposing wing player while providing much needed help defense as a tremendous weak side shot blocker. Although he didn't win Defensive Player of the Year in 2010, he did make it to his first and only All-Star team while also being named First Team All-Defense. While the Bobcats did make the playoffs for the first time in franchise history, Wallace and the Bobcats got swept by the Dwight Howard-led Orlando Magic in the first round. The following season, Wallace was traded to Portland. That season, Portland made the playoffs, and although they lost to the eventual champion Dallas Mavericks in the first round, they really pushed Dallas hard. All 6 games that series were pretty close games, including the 4 that Portland lost, and Wallace played pretty well that series as well. By 2012, Wallace was already 30 years old and declining athletically. He was traded to the Nets, who then traded him to the Boston Celtics in that infamous Celtics-Nets trade, which will probably surely go down as the worst trade in NBA history. During his time on the Nets and Celtics, Gerald Wallace suffered a variety of injuries, most of them minor ones that kept him out only for a couple of weeks, but the accumulation of stress and tear on his body eventually got to him. In 2015, Wallace was traded by the Celtics to the Warriors, who then waived him due to his physical health. Wallace hasn't played in the NBA since, despite only being 32 years old when he played his last NBA game. I want to spend some time talking about Wallace's playstyle and what made him a unique player. At 6'7" and 215 pounds, Wallace had the perfect size for your modern day forward. With his freakish athleticism, Wallace put up many poster dunks throughout his career, even participating in the 2002 dunk contest, where he was runner-up to Jason Richardson. For the majority of his career, Wallace played small forward, although in many lineups he would play the 4 as well. Offensively, Wallace's biggest strength was attacking the rim. His size and quickness, coupled with his leaping ability, made him a difficult player to block. Upon studying Wallace on tape, one of his go-to moves is his one dribble, 2-stride layup. For someone who wasn't the greatest shooter in the world, Wallace had pretty nice touch around the rim. You can tell that he took advantage of his attacking ability both through the film and through the stats. Despite mostly being a wing player, 54% of Wallace's shots in his career were around the rim in the 0 to 3 foot range. You contrast this number to the other forwards that are known for their attacking ability during that era, like let's say LeBron James or Sean Marion, and it goes to show how unusual it was for a 6'7" wing player to be so relentless going at the rim. Some of this also had to do with his off-ball cutting. Wallace was really active off the ball and quite sneaky and crafty with the way he finds holes in the defense. Now, there were a couple of major weaknesses to Wallace's game that prevented him from reaching the next level as an elite scorer. One was his shooting. Although Wallace could heat up like any other player, his shot was pretty inconsistent for both mid-range and from 3. Wallace was around 35% from mid-range and 31% from 3 during his career. In large part because of that, Wallace didn't have as much of a post fadeaway or pull-up jumper as opposed to other scoring forwards like Paul Pierce or Carmelo Anthony. You can see this on tape since every time he got the ball in the post matched up against a shorter or skinnier player, Wallace would bully him to the lane and lay it up or toss up a hook or floater instead of working some fancy fadeaway. On defense though is where Wallace really put his athleticism to great use. First off, he was an awesome rebounder as a small forward and as a general wing player. His incredible vertical leap also made him one of the best help defenders in the league, especially in the paint. Seeing as he's only 6'7", most of Wallace's blocks didn't come from direct challenges the same way a Rudy Gobert or even a Roy Hibbert would get their blocks. Rather, Wallace's blocks came from the weak side. He was exceptional at stalking a player who's maneuvering into the lane and timing it just right to swat the ball. Additionally, Wallace had pretty good lateral quickness, which meant that he could defend and contain almost every wing player in the league. When he really focuses on defense and hustles, he could intercept passes with his long reach and strip wing players that lacked the necessary ball handling skills. To me, Wallace was actually born 10 years too early. If he were still in his prime today, he would be awesome as a power forward or even a small ball center in certain cases. He could space the floor pretty well since he still had to guard him when he was open, but he would be great at setting screens, catching the ball, and attacking off the dribble. He wasn't a particularly gifted passer, but Wallace could make the right play on offense if he got double teamed. But even more so than his offense, defensively is where Wallace would just simply be amazing in today's league. A lot of his defensive talents were honestly a bit wasted during that era, since he would be perfect in today's switch-heavy league. More and more teams recognize the importance of having players between 6'6" and 6'9" that can defend both guards and big men, and Gerald Wallace was exactly that type of player. His athleticism also meant that he could lead a fast break with shooters around him. Think of Gerald Wallace in today's league as Draymond Green, but more athletic and less emotional. That's more or less who he would be. Maybe not as smart a player as Draymond is, but a lot better offensively and a much better scorer. It's a shame that Wallace wasted so many years playing on some of the worst teams in NBA history in Charlotte, and that he never prolonged his career due to injuries. In the right circumstances, he would have made an awesome second in command for many stars during that era. A Carmelo and Gerald Wallace forward combo would have been awesome to watch, since those two would make up for each other's deficiencies on separate ends of the floor. Gerald Wallace and CP3 would have made an awesome duo in New Orleans or Charlotte or whatever. I can totally imagine CP3 tossing lobs to Wallace on the fast break or finding him on backdoor cuts. Anyways, those are just some weird scenarios that ran through my head. I hope you enjoyed this video on Gerald Wallace. If you did, leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. In the meantime, let me know your thoughts on either Twitter or Instagram. You can message me any other future future players who you haven't seen a video like this done on them before, but you think would make an interesting video. Other than that, thank you for watching. I'll see you next video.